Earl Robertson was an extremely organized individual. He had never missed a day of work, and not seeing him a half an hour early was unusual. So when he was an hour late, his secretary Margie was understandably concerned. Not only was he late, but he was late to a meeting he had set up. Something was clearly wrong. It was 1997, and people didn't have cell phones, so all Margie could do was call his house, but there was no answer. Most people would probably assume something had come up and they would eventually hear from him, but not Margie. She knew that Earl would never be late and not call, so she contacted the local sheriff's department and asked for a welfare check. That would start the process of the authorities uncovering a murder more violent than anything they had ever seen. This is Monsters. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to tell you about my new headphones. I've been wanting a pair of these for a while, and now that I have them, I wish I'd gotten them sooner. These are the Heavies, the world's first headphones built for heavy metal and more. They have 8 drivers with patented speaker placement, creating a naturally immersive sound field, mimicking a live experience. But they aren't just for heavy metal. These headphones sound great with any genre. Many of you know I'm a big old punk rocker, and these are great for that. I've tested them with rock, pop, and even lighter acoustic music, and it all sounds amazing. These headphones not only sound good, but they feel good. They cover my whole ear, and even though they're lightweight, they don't feel flimsy. The battery life is incredible, with 50 hours with noise canceling off and 40 hours with it on. They also have these things called shells. They're like skins for your headphones, and there are a select group of artists you can get shells for, such as Motorhead, like here. They also have artists like Cannibal Corpse, Dropkick Murphys, or even Body Count. On top of that, they have the Hex gaming attachment, so you can bring immersive audio to your co-op gaming sessions. If you want to listen to your music with incredible quality and comfort, pick up a pair of Heavy's H1H headphones today. You can either use the promo code MONSTERS or use the link in the description to get $40 off your order. Again, that's promo code MONSTERS for $40 off your order. Ethel Terry DeJarnette, who went by Terry, was born on March 29, 1984 in Atlanta, Georgia. Her father had been a colonel in the U.S. Army, and once he retired, the family settled in Milledgeville, Georgia, about 2 hours southeast of Atlanta. Her mother was a bit of a socialite and spent her time trying to make connections with people high on the social ladder. The frequent travel of a military family took its toll on Terry as a child. She wanted to have long-term friendships, but it was an impossibility with the numerous moves, even if that meant she got to see new and exciting places like Japan and France. She completed high school in Atlanta before enrolling at Agnes Scott College, an all-girls school in Decatur. The school had strict rules about students visiting boys, but Terry still managed to get out and meet new potential suitors. It was at a fraternity party that she met a man named Earl Robertson. Earl Robertson was born on May 12, 1948 in Noonan, Georgia. He was the son of a U.S. Navy veteran who had served in World War II. Not much is known about his childhood, but he was a good enough student to go to the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he studied engineering. When Earl met Terry at that frat party, he was immediately in love. He had a plan for his life, and he wanted Terry to be a part of it. So on Valentine's Day of 1970, only months after they had met, he proposed and Terry accepted. By then, Earl had already accepted a job at Spring Mills Incorporated, a textile company based in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Their wedding was planned for after their graduations in August of 1970, after which they would move to Fort Mill. Once Mr. and Mrs. Robertson arrived in their new town, they moved into an apartment where a number of Earl's co-workers also lived. Eventually, they bought a house in nearby Rock Hill. Not long after moving into their first house together, their first child was born. James DeJarnette Robertson, who went by Jimmy, was born on November 17, 1973. They named him after Terry's father, and he was born on her mother's birthday. 2 years later, Earl Lamar Robertson Jr., who would go by Chip, was born. It wasn't long after Chip was born that Terry began struggling with her mental health. She felt like she wasn't a good enough mother and even feared that she didn't know how to hold her children properly. It didn't help that her own mother constantly criticized her parenting abilities. Anxiety was not a new feeling for Terry, as she grew up feeling like she wasn't a good enough daughter. She spent her entire life trying to please everybody and feeling like she wasn't succeeding. At the same time, Earl was climbing the ladder at Spring Mills, and by the late 70s he was the third-ranking executive at the company. When Spring Mills bought another company in Fresno, California, the Robertsons moved out so Earl could work on the new business. Terry worried that moving around frequently might be rough on their children like it was on her as a child, but at least it gave her some distance between her and her mother. After that, Earl was sent to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Jimmy started elementary school, but about 4 years later they moved back to Rock Hill. They reconnected with friends and got involved in community organizations. Terry became the president of the PTA and stayed busy organizing fundraisers as Earl continued grinding away at Spring Mills. As Jimmy became a teen, his behavior started turning off the kids who he used to be friends with. At school, he was bullied for being small and awkward. A teacher once told Terry that he thought Jimmy was troubled and he was headed toward a grave or a cell. Despite that, he was part of the Boy Scouts, where he would eventually become an Eagle Scout, the highest rank in the organization. In his junior year, he won a scholarship to study in Germany for a year. That was a double-edged sword because it recognized his academic success, but the time in Germany only helped along his problematic behavior. With his parents sending him $1,000 a month and a low drinking age, Jimmy abused his freedom every chance he could. When he graduated from high school in 1992, he enrolled at Georgia Institute of Technology, just like his father. Of course, Earl was thrilled and hoped that his son would succeed, but Jimmy wasn't the fastidious student that his father had been. He made C's and D's in most of his classes and scored an A in psychology. He was placed on academic probation and improved his grades the following semester, but the improvement was short-lived. After that, he returned to receiving C's and D's and eventually failed all of his classes. By 1994, Earl and Terry had recognized that Jimmy was out of control. After he failed out of college, they allowed him to live at home, but they required him to pay his own way for everything, including rent. He liked the food service industry and began working there, but couldn't keep a regular job. He frequently failed drug tests, and in 1995 he was arrested for driving under the influence multiple times. He had also begun gambling to the point of losing upwards of $1,000 in one session. He had taken to stealing blank checks from his parents, making them out for hundreds of dollars and forging his father's signature. Jimmy's violent side showed when he attempted to protect his girlfriend. He was dating a girl named Erin Savage. When Erin told her boyfriend that a guy at work had been harassing her, they went to a local Waffle House restaurant where a friend gave them a container of old grease. Then they went to the offending person's apartment complex, found his car, poured the grease all over it, and slashed the tires. He did begin seeing a therapist, and at first it seemed like things were improving. Terry also started seeing the same therapist due to depression, and it seemed like things were looking up for the Robertsons. With two of the family members getting help with their mental health, it was hoped that they would see a new era of healthy behavior on the horizon. Unfortunately, therapy didn't change Jimmy's behavior the way his parents had hoped. In August of 1995, Terry asked her son for his rent, and he became so angry that she feared for her safety. She later called the police, who picked him up from work and took him to the William S. Hall Psychiatric Institute in Columbia, where he was involuntarily committed. It was there that Jimmy expressed his belief that he was being persecuted by his mother. He also told the doctor that he regularly went without sleep, sometimes only getting about 30 minutes a night. The doctor determined that Jimmy had poor emotional control, was passive-aggressive, and that, quote, Loss of anger control to the extent of harming others is a possibility. Like when Jimmy started seeing a therapist, Terry also eventually checked herself into the psychiatric institute due to thoughts of suicide. It seems she had a very difficult time being away from her children. With Jimmy in a psychiatric hospital due to his own depression and violent behavior, much of those feelings were likely redirected inward toward her own potential failings as a mother. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder and released just days before Christmas of 1995. Over the following year, Terry and Earl argued about the idea of making Jimmy find his own place to live. Earl was ready to cut the cord and force Jimmy to learn to take care of himself, for better or worse. Terry couldn't handle the thought of her boy not having his parents as a crutch and possibly getting himself into an even worse situation than he was already in. Before Jimmy could move out of his parents' house on his own, though, he was forced out by the law. On July 20th, 1996, Jimmy broke into a neighbor's house through a window and stole items that he could sell for cash. He returned multiple times throughout the day so he could take as much as possible. He stole jewelry, a camera, a television set, as well as blank checks and credit cards. Then he also stole the neighbor's Toyota Celica. He used a credit card for a Sears department store to buy 6 televisions, 6 VCRs, multiple radar detectors, and a set of tires. The goods valued about $3,800. For you youngsters out there, a radar detector was a little device we used in the 90s that you would put in your car and it would beep when it sensed radar equipment nearby. That meant a cop was up ahead with a radar gun that measured speed. Then you would slow down before you got to what we called a speed trap and not get a ticket. For those of you outside of the US, police actually sit on the side of the road with a radar gun and wait for people to speed instead of doing something more useful. Jimmy also forged a check to purchase roses from a florist, which he likely gave to his girlfriend. It wasn't difficult to link him to the theft, so he was arrested and made a full confession, claiming he wore socks on his hands so he wouldn't leave any fingerprints. Jimmy was sent to Lee Correctional Institute and remained there for almost a year. In prison, Jimmy attended Narcotics Anonymous and took a stress and anger management class. In the class, he was given a stress management booklet where he described his feelings, which he would take with him when he was released. While that was happening, the Robertsons realized that their younger son Chip was also drinking and doing drugs. He came home from the University of Pennsylvania in the summer of 1997, just a few weeks before Jimmy was released from prison. His parents didn't think living under the same roof would be a good situation, so Earl paid the first month's rent and a deposit to rent a room in an apartment. Despite their clear efforts to change their situation for the better, the worst was still to come. Jimmy had met Meredith Moon before he went to prison, as she was best friends with his girlfriend Erin. When he was arrested, Erin's parents forbade her from seeing him, and her father even confronted the soon-to-be convict and told him to leave her alone. When Jimmy got out of prison, he began working at a Pizza Hut in the food court of Winthrop University with Meredith, and the two hit it off. Meredith had started her life in Georgia, but after her parents divorced when she was in her early teens, she moved with her father to Rock Hill. In high school, Meredith was on the Northwestern High Air Force ROTC, and she was on a leadership track. As far as her father knew, she was an angel who came right home after school and studied, but that was more of an act. She drank alcohol but preferred to smoke pot. She had a pierced tongue, a pierced nipple, and a tattoo on her right ankle. She still did well academically, but she was bullied due to her size. By the end of her high school career, she was 6 feet or 182 centimeters tall and almost 300 pounds or 136 kilograms. She was a big girl, and the other students didn't shy away from reminding her, so she kept herself numb by being high as much as possible. She would regularly smoke a couple of joints during lunch to help get through the day. After high school, she ran into Jimmy at work and they started a relationship. She basically moved into his room with him and they spent all of their time together. It was her first relationship, so she likely ignored behavior that might have been a red flag for other girls. He also liked to drink and do drugs, and that was all she really cared about at that moment. The resident that Jimmy rented a room from was becoming increasingly unhappy about the amount of people Jimmy had over and how much drug activity was happening in his apartment. To make matters worse for the Robertsons, Chip had been prescribed Ritalin when he was younger, but instead of taking it, he was selling it to other people to use recreationally. Two of his customers were Jimmy and Meredith. Then Jimmy was asked to leave the apartment and had to move back in with his parents. By the time Jimmy was back in his childhood home, Chip had returned to Philadelphia for school. Jimmy was not shy about his anger towards his parents. It seemed he had mentioned wanting to kill them to Meredith on multiple occasions. Earl had spent much of his life as a dedicated and valued part of the Spring Mills Corporation, and he had made good money in the process. Between their assets and their life insurance policies, the Robertsons were worth a couple of $1 million at the time. Jimmy believed that his parents' death would benefit him twofold. First, he would inherit enough money to live however he wanted, and second, he would be rid of his parents who were constantly meddling in his life and trying to get him to clean up his act. I know, what jerks. So the idea of killing his parents and living free with his half of the inheritance became a real option for Jimmy. Meredith seemed to think that he was just ranting, but she would soon learn just how serious he was. On November 24, 1997, Jimmy and Meredith spent the day in a fairly typical manner. Jimmy worked during the day and Meredith hung out with Aaron. She had snorted a line of Ritalin earlier that day, so by the time she was home for the night, she couldn't sleep. Shocking. Jimmy called her at about 3 in the morning and asked if he could use her mother's credit card to buy Chip a ticket home from school for the Thanksgiving holiday, but she said no. At about 5, he called back and asked her to come to his house. She assumed they were going to drive to Philly and pick up his brother, so she grabbed a change of clothes and headed to the Robertsons. She parked her blue Honda Accord on the road at the edge of their property and went inside the house through the back door. When the boys were young, Earl and Terry turned the basement into a 2-bedroom apartment for them. It had its own small kitchen, bathroom, living room area, and a pool table where they could hang out with their friends. When Jimmy moved back in, that's where he had been living. Once Meredith was inside, she sat down and Jimmy told her he was gonna do it. He said, quote, "I'm going to kill my parents." They spent the next few hours snorting Ritalin until about 7 a.m. when Jimmy put his plan into motion. It was only a few hours later that people started noticing something was wrong. Earl was late to work, which was already out of character for him, but he was missing a meeting that he himself had set up. Knowing how reliable and punctual her boss was, Margie Jordan called the York County Sheriff's Office and requested a welfare check. Terry had asked a friend, Martha George, to make her a cake and she was supposed to pick it up that morning, but never arrived. Martha called her house multiple times with no answer, so she called the counseling office where Terry worked part-time. The office manager, Debbie Brisson, also called the Robertson house multiple times, and after getting no answer, she decided to drive over there. Before she got there, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the house and knocked on the door. He got no answer, so he looked in a few windows and didn't see anything that looked out of place. He noticed a neighbor working in their yard, so he asked if they had seen the Robertsons. The neighbor said that Earl usually left for work before he was up. He told the deputy that if the red car was gone, then Earl was gone. There was no red car in the driveway, so the deputy radioed in and said the house was secure and everything seemed fine. He was told to call Margie at Spring Hill, so the deputy left the scene to find a payphone. While he was gone, Debbie showed up and started looking around the house. She found the back door open and glass in the door had been broken. When she went upstairs, she went down a hall and turned a corner where she found Earl laying face down on the floor. He was lying in a pool of blood and his skull had been crushed. She tried to run out of the house, but both the front door and the kitchen door were locked and needed a key on the inside to unlock them. Where I worked in construction years ago, those types of deadbolts were against code because it made it impossible to escape your house in an emergency like a fire or, well, a murderous son. The deputy had talked to Margie on the phone, and not only did she tell him that Earl had never missed a day of work in 27 years, but he's never even been late. She also told him that one of his sons had been released from prison months earlier, and that made the deputy reconsider his opinion that everything was fine at the Robertson house. He drove back to the property where he saw an additional car in the driveway, but not the red Mazda that was supposed to belong to Earl. After realizing that both main floor doors of the house were locked from the inside, Debbie saw the patrol car pull up through a window and motioned to him that the doors were locked. She met him at a window around the back of the house and he pulled her outside. She told him that Earl was dead. When backup arrived, the deputies went into the house through the back door, clearing the scene as they worked their way upstairs. They found Earl in the upstairs hall, bloody and wearing only a pair of white underwear. He had been beaten so badly that his head was compared to a crushed tomato. Past his body in the bedroom, they found Terry, also covered with blood, lying on the floor between the bed and the wall. One side of her neck was cut and there was another cut across her cheek. She had multiple injuries to her head that would later be determined to have been made by both the strike side and claw side of a hammer. One side of the bed was stained with blood, and there was a kitchen knife with the tip broken off in the center of the mattress. After clearing the rest of the house, the deputies left the same way they entered and called in detectives. Detectives talked to neighbors, and one of them said they saw Jimmy and a blonde girl get into Earl's Mazda earlier that morning. He said he had waved at them, and they waved back. They put something into the trunk of the car and drove away. A blue Honda parked near the property was found to be registered to Douglas Moon. When investigators talked to Doug, he said he had never met Jimmy and didn't know his daughter Meredith was involved with him. He did know they worked together, and Doug admitted that he seemed like a nice guy. He explained that he woke up when the phone rang early that morning and Meredith told him it was Aaron. Shortly after, Meredith told him she was going to Aaron's house. She claimed the girl had cut herself and needed to be taken to the hospital. That was obviously a lie, and Meredith was really going to the Robertsons' house to meet Jimmy. Doug called Aaron to ask about his daughter's whereabouts, and she explained what they had done the night before and that she had dropped Meredith off at home sometime after midnight. She hadn't seen her since, but Meredith had called her later that morning from a gas station and told her that she and Jimmy were on their way to Philadelphia. Inside the house, forensic technicians found the contents of Terry's wallet on the floor by her. While they were working, the detectives started tracing phone records and credit card activity. They found that Jimmy had called Chip at 2:33 that morning and talked to him for 34 minutes. Then he called right back at 3:07 a.m. and talked for another 3 minutes. They immediately started finding transactions on Earl's credit card that pointed in the direction of Philly. Jimmy and Meredith had stopped at the Peach Stand about 12 miles or 20 kilometers north of Rock Hill. They charged $38.21 worth of food and fuel to the card and were seen on surveillance in the store. The store clerk said that the two seemed, quote, happy as a lark. Later that afternoon, the same card was used to purchase fuel again in Ladysmith, Virginia, about 2/3 of the way to Philly. It was pretty obvious that Jimmy and Meredith were on their way to Chip's apartment, so they contacted the authorities in Pennsylvania who staked out the area and waited. Sure enough, at about 8 p.m., a red Mazda Protege pulled onto 41st Street and parked. 4 officers approached the vehicle, guns drawn, and pulled the 2 occupants out of the car. The couple were arrested for suspicion of murder and held at the jail in Philadelphia while detectives from South Carolina made their way up to interview the main suspects in the murder of Earl and Terry Robertson. Before Jimmy and Meredith even arrived in Philly, authorities called Chip and asked him to come to the police station for questioning. He agreed, and once there, a detective asked him what he had talked to his brother about during their early morning phone call. They suspected that the 2 siblings had planned the murder together, but Chip remained adamant that Jimmy never said anything about his plan to murder their parents. Chip was released and returned the following day to talk to detectives from South Carolina. Detective Ralph Missel talked to Chip before sitting down with Meredith in the interrogation room she had been held in all night. He had learned that Meredith wasn't a troublemaker, she had no criminal record, and had grown up being bullied. She was a follower who was likely easily manipulated by Jimmy due to him being the only person who treated her well. The detective was sure that she was not a hardened killer and would likely crack under the pressure. Sure enough, after a few introductory questions, Meredith told Detective Missile exactly what had happened the night before. She had told an officer earlier that she had just waited in her car while Jimmy was in the house, but this time she told the whole truth. Meredith said she had lied to her father about where she was going and drove to the Robertson house. In the basement, Jimmy told her he was going to kill his parents, and she claimed to have tried to talk him out of it but didn't do anything else to stop him. She said he had ranted about killing his parents before, but nobody took him seriously. He had claimed to people that he put rat poison in his father's drink once, but changed his mind and dumped it out before Earl could drink it. Meredith couldn't say if that was true or not, though. They spent a few hours downstairs where they snorted about 10 lines of crushed-up Ritalin. When Jimmy heard Earl's alarm clock go off at 7 a.m., he waited until he got into the shower. Then he told Meredith to wait in the basement before walking up the stairs. Jimmy went into his parents' bedroom where he attacked Terry with a hammer. Meredith said she heard the struggle and listened as the mother called out for her husband and then said, quote, "No, Jimmy." Jimmy struck Terry multiple times with the hammer before spinning it around and hitting her with the claw side. He used his parents' habits against them as he knew his father showered in the bathroom down the hall so as to not wake his wife. That simple consideration made it possible for Jimmy to kill his mother first while Earl was in the shower, not able to hear the commotion. Meredith said that, while Jimmy was murdering his mother, she went out onto the back porch and smoked. Right after she went back inside, Jimmy called down the stairs, and when she went to the staircase, he told her to get a knife from the kitchen and bring it to him. She claimed that, at that point, she was going to leave and tried to go out the door to the garage, but the deadbolt was locked and couldn't be unlocked without a key, so she relented and brought Jimmy a knife before returning to the basement. The shower was still running for a few more minutes, and that was the time when Jimmy was stabbing and slashing his mother. Meredith said the shower stopped, and a minute later she could hear a thumping sound coming from upstairs. Jimmy had surprised Earl as he came out of the bathroom and beat him repeatedly with an aluminum baseball bat. When the bodies were found, Earl had a mark on his back that was a straight line up and down his spine. It would later be revealed that Jimmy had hit him so hard with the bat that it left a severe impression on his back. Jimmy came back to the basement, but after a minute he heard a noise and went back upstairs. When he returned, he took off his blood-soaked clothes, put them into a garbage bag, and took a shower. He put the hammer, the baseball bat, and a container of liquid into the bag as well. Meredith explained that she helped Jimmy clean up the bathroom before they left out the back door. As they did, Jimmy grabbed a rake and used it to bust out a pane of glass in the door to make it seem like a robbery. It's fascinating that Jimmy ever thought he would get away with the crime. As they were putting the bag of evidence into Earl's Mazda, the neighbor saw them and waved. Then they left Meredith's car at the scene. It wasn't going to be hard for investigators to connect them to the crime. Of course, Jimmy tried to throw them off by leaving a note inside the house that was supposed to be to his parents informing them that he was going to pick up Chip from school. That only made authorities more suspicious. They also immediately noticed that the glass had clearly not been broken in an attempt to get into the house. When a door is closed and the window is broken from the outside, the glass shards fall a certain way. The way the glass shards had fallen onto the ground didn't add up with the window being broken from the outside. Also, the actual edges of broken glass will show a specific pattern moving one direction depending on which side of the glass was struck. Evidence showed that the window had been struck from the inside, not the outside. It was just made to look like a break-in. Then they headed north, using Earl's credit card the entire way. Beside the stops for gas and food, Meredith explained that they also stopped at a gas station in Maryland and threw the garbage bag in a dumpster. Authorities in Maryland were notified, and officers went to the gas station where they found the bag exactly where Meredith said it would be. Inside were the hammer, the bat, and Jimmy's clothes, all covered in blood. After her statement was written out and signed, Meredith was led to a cell where she awaited extradition. Detective Missel talked to Jimmy next, and it was immediately apparent that the young man thought he was the smartest person in the room. The detective explained that Meredith had made a full confession and that they had found the garbage bag and its contents. Jimmy told the detective that he had no idea what was in the bag. Meredith had told him to get the bag out of the trunk and throw it away. He said he didn't even know how it got into the trunk. Yeah, real smart. Then he told Detective Missel, quote, "Only two people know what happened in that house, Meredith and me. The truth will come out at the right time." The interview ended there. Though Meredith would choose to waive an extradition hearing and return to South Carolina without a fight, stubborn Jimmy was not going to make things easy. He fought extradition and begged Chip to hire him a lawyer. He wrote a letter to Chip that said, quote, "This is a terrible tragedy, but what's done is done, and maybe one day we will all know the truth. Not just what the media or the DA's office thinks is the truth." What does that even mean, and how do you refer to your parents' gruesome murder as what's done is done? He went on to suggest one top-notch lawyer that would cost $175,000 and another that would only set him back $75,000. He was already spending the inheritance that he'd murdered his parents to get, to try and get away with that very murder. He didn't seem to understand that his brother did not have immediate access to his parents' estate. First, everything was held in abeyance because it needed to be clear that Chip was not implicated in the murders of his parents. During that time, he was given an allowance that would cover his monthly expenses. Certainly not enough to hire even a $75,000 lawyer, even if he wanted to. Which it seemed he didn't. Chip never responded to any of Jimmy's correspondence. Jimmy wrote a letter to the financial advisor who was handling the estate asking why Chip wasn't responding, but he didn't get an answer. He eventually wrote to Chip again and said, quote, "Regardless of your decision of what side you choose to stand on, we will still be brothers and I will always love you." Probably not a comfort coming from the sibling who murdered your parents. Jimmy was finally extradited back to South Carolina in February of 1998. When the Robertsons' financial situation was investigated, it became clear that it was the motive for the crime. Earl's estate was valued at about $1.5 million, and Terry's was valued at just over $600,000. Their two sons were the beneficiaries and would each expect to inherit a little over $1 million in the event of their parents' death. Meredith was taken back to South Carolina and eventually chose to assist the prosecutors in the case against Jimmy. Of course, Jimmy was part of that decision as he had sent her a letter while they were in jail that read, quote, "Go fuck yourself." It allowed Meredith to realize who Jimmy really was and that she did not deserve to lose her life for him. She spent the next year or so behind bars working to better herself mentally and physically. She said she could hear Terry's screams all the time and it caused her to do a lot of soul searching. She also lost weight, and by the time of the trial, she was down about 90 pounds or 40 kilograms. Meredith ended up pleading guilty to 2 counts of accessory after the fact and 2 counts of armed robbery. She testified at Jimmy's trial about the events of the evening, from being called by Jimmy to being at his house while he murdered his parents. Obviously, the question of why she didn't leave while he was upstairs came up. The prosecutor asked because they knew the defense surely would, and they wanted to get out ahead of it. She had claimed before that the upstairs doors were locked, but she had been in the basement and could have left out the back door. In fact, based on her own story, she went outside and smoked. Why didn't she leave? She explained to the jury that she was too scared. She wasn't sure what to do, so she just did nothing. She said that Jimmy had manipulated her during their time together and she was terrified of what would happen no matter what she chose to do. She revealed that the garbage bag was tossed in a dumpster at a gas station on the way to Philadelphia. He was later presented as evidence showing the contents to be the murder weapons and that the blood matched Earl and Terry. Meredith described the nearly 10-hour drive and Jimmy's behavior. She described him as beaming when he talked about what he had done and how he was going to spend his inheritance. He told her that he was going to build a house on a lake or maybe buy a club and renovate it. She said that while they drove, he explained his plan for after they picked up Chip. He told her that when they got back to the house in Rock Hill, she would get directly into her car and leave. Then he and Chip would go into the house where they would discover their parents dead and call 911. Once they got to Chip's apartment, they weren't immediately arrested. The first time they arrived, they knocked but nobody answered, so they went to a local pizza restaurant and ate. Chip wasn't home because he was at the police station being questioned about the murder of his parents. It wasn't until Jimmy and Meredith returned to his apartment about 30 minutes later that they were arrested. During her cross-examination, the defense went over the conditions of her plea deal, trying to make it seem like she was lying in order to get a lighter sentence, which doesn't seem like it would make Jimmy any less guilty. The murder weapons were found exactly where Meredith said they would be, and Jimmy's bloody clothes were in the bag. There were no bloody clothes in the bag that looked like they would belong to her. The neighbor also saw them both leave around the time of the murders. Even if Meredith was more involved than she was claiming, Jimmy still clearly carried out the murders of his parents. Then the defense brought up her weight loss. Not to point out that she had been working to improve herself, to point out that she had been much heavier at the time of the murders. He suggested that she was bigger than Jimmy and she could have physically stopped him from what he was doing. Of course, physical size is not the only factor in deciding what your actions are going to be. A person's mental state is a much bigger part of the equation. Of course, nobody else was in that house, and I can't say with 100% certainty that Meredith told the truth about what happened there, but based on the personalities of her and Jimmy, it seems pretty plausible. Jimmy was an abusive, violent person who was willing to take advantage of others for his own gain, and Meredith was a self-conscious victim of bullying who was overly eager to make her first boyfriend happy. At the end of the day, the defense was not able to make Meredith seem like the manipulative liar they wanted to paint her as, and the jury seemed to find her credible. The rest of the trial went as expected. The medical examiner described the wounds and cause of death. Forensic experts testified about the blood on the hammer, baseball bat, and knife all belonging to Earl and Terry. Eyewitnesses testified that Jimmy had been there the morning of the murders. That, along with Meredith's testimony, showed how strong the prosecution's case was. But the defense wasn't expecting to get a not guilty verdict. Their main goal was to keep Jimmy from receiving the death penalty. When Jimmy was asked if he wanted to testify on his own behalf, he declined. When the defense was asked if they had any witnesses, they said no. What they did do, however, was present a motion for a direct verdict on the ground that the two victims had never been identified as Earl and Terry Robertson. That's right. In a very sad attempt to get their client off of a murder charge, they argued that Jimmy had been indicted for the murder of Earl and Terry Robertson, but there had been no evidence presented during the trial that identified the victims as Earl and Terry Robertson. Get the fuck out of here. The medical examiner presented his findings for the autopsy of Earl and Terry. Friends of the Robertsons had testified about Earl and Terry and their relationship with their sons. Meredith had testified that she was at the Robertson house while Jimmy went upstairs and murdered his parents. She heard Terry cry out for Earl. You mean to tell me you think there might be some question as to who the victims were? Unsurprisingly, the attempt failed and the judge denied the request. The jury came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. The next stage of the trial was to argue the case on whether or not Jimmy would be sentenced to death. The defense didn't argue that Jimmy hadn't murdered his parents, but they used mental illness as a reason why he couldn't control himself. Unlike with his trial, Jimmy did testify on his own behalf, not seeming as smug as he had been during the trial, but not really displaying any remorse. He said, quote, "I'll never be able to explain. I'll never know why or how or anything. I know that it happened." Another what's done is done statement like the one he made to his brother. Despite his plea, the jury unanimously decided to sentence James Robertson to death. People say that it was a decision that Earl and Terry wouldn't have wanted, but that's kind of the point. Earl and Terry weren't there anymore because Jimmy had savagely beaten and stabbed them to death. Jimmy initially asked the South Carolina Supreme Court to execute him immediately, but eventually dropped that request and began the appeals process. He was given permission to act as his own lawyer, and from there he said he wasn't sure what he would do. He suggested he might just tie the system up for a while until he was ready to die, and then he would withdraw all his appeals. It was classic Jimmy needing to do whatever he could to hold on to that last tiny bit of control. He also wrote letters to Meredith claiming that he had information that could free them both, but that would be morally corrupt as he felt they both needed to be punished. You can't see this, but I'm rolling my eyes. Of course, he also told her that it was her fault he was on death row. He wrote, quote, "Can you honestly say to me that you know what happened upstairs that night? Can you tell me for sure that my parents were in the house? Can you say that all the blood didn't come from killing the dog or the cat? I know the answer. Answer it yourself." Yes, Jimmy, we do know that the blood wasn't from the dog or cat, mainly because the dog and cat weren't dead. Earl and Terry were. Deputies didn't go into your house and find a dead dog or cat anywhere. They found 2 dead human beings. The people you killed. Even after years serving on death row, Jimmy Robertson had not changed at all. Meredith was sentenced to 10 years for the 2 counts of accessory after the fact and 10 years for the 2 counts of robbery, with those sentences to be served consecutively. She was released on parole after serving 10 years and she moved to Georgia. She got married, had a family, and stayed out of trouble. People still question if Chip had been involved in the plan to murder Earl and Terry. Jimmy had called him a few hours before the murder and was going to use him as an alibi, but there was no evidence found linking him to the murders. Jimmy said that he had only called his brother to discuss a plan to pick him up so he could be home for Thanksgiving. Meredith had testified that Jimmy was raving about how proud Chip was going to be of him after the murder, but Jimmy said it was all just drug-fueled rambling. Chip's behavior was questionable after his parents died. He left school and moved into their house, regularly hosting parties, even before the blood was cleaned up. Chip was a troubled young man with a drug and alcohol problem that had just been given a reasonable amount of financial freedom, something that is not a recipe for success. He hadn't been given his entire inheritance yet, but he didn't have to work. By the time Jimmy was sentenced, Chip was in jail. He had been arrested on December 30th, 1998 for check forgery and distribution of cocaine and Xanax. Chip pleaded guilty to the charges and received 5 years of probation and a 3-month stay in rehab. He would later say that the arrest saved his life. Once out of rehab, Chip returned to college and had repaired his relationship with his brother. He regularly visits Jimmy, who is still on death row awaiting execution. A spoiled child, a family with a history of mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse. Was Jimmy born evil, or did he grow up in a cauldron brewing a perfect recipe to make a monster? If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.